Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, salatu wassalam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in, amma ba'd. Inshallah, continuing the station of al-Rajaa, we have come to the words of Abu Ismail, rahimahullah ta'ala, who says, الرجاء على ثلاث درجات. الدرجة الأولى رجاء يبعث العامل على الاجتهاد ويولد التلذذ بالخدمة ويوقظ الطباع للسماحة بترك المنهي. Did we talk about the first level? I feel like we spoke about it. I think we spoke about the first level, right?
Yes, we did.
Okay, all right. So the second level. الدرجة الثانية رجاء أرباب الرياضات أن يبلغوا موقفا تصفو فيه هممهم برفض الملذوذات ولزوم شروط العلم واستقصاء حدود الحمية. Okay, a lot of jargon that's being thrown around here, so I'm not going to waste time trying to translate it, but we'll go through the steps, inshallah. So this level, as you know, Abu Ismail has done before, he differentiates. He shows the difference between the levels. Okay, the first level are normally you find this group of people in it, and then that group of people in the second level, and then this group of people in the third level. For here, the second level is arbab al-riyadat, this concept of exercise. Right? We spoke about exercise before. We said that riyada, exercise, there's a type of spiritual exercising. And here, he's using the word again. These are people, those who are at the second level of hope, they are exercising certain behaviors and practices. And what that is the following. These are people who are striving for themselves by leaving that which is near to them and replacing it with things that are near to them but better and more beneficial. What that means is the following. We have, dealing with Muslims, it's very known and it's easy to observe that Muslims love Islam. Muslims love Allah. They love the Messenger. They love the Quran, right? Muslims, generally speaking, they aspire, they always have the feeling that, I wish I could be a better Muslim. It's very, very rare to come by a Muslim who could care less about their Islam. I'm not talking about in terms of their practice. I'm talking about in terms of their hearts. Even Muslims who are not practicing, they might not pray, they might not fast Ramadan, they might not be giving their zakah, they might be involved in Islamically immoral behaviors, but Iman is always a light in the heart of a person, and it requires severe circumstances for that light to really be put off. In fact, someone who leaves Islam, we actually ask the question, was the light ever there in the first place? And what you find is that most people who apostate from Islam is because that light was never lit in the first place. They were born into a Muslim family who cared less about Islam. They never spoke about Islam, had no attachment, no connection to the masjid, no connection to any of their rituals. So this individual is being brought up without any Islam in the first place. So, generally speaking, Muslims always aspire to something more positive in terms of their relationship with their religion. And also all Muslims love Allah and love the Prophet ﷺ and the Quran, etc., even if their expression of that is weaker. So here Abu Ismail rahimahullah ta'ala is saying that this second level of hope are for people who are exercising the following. They are trying to leave that which is near and dear to them and replace it with something that is near and dear to them but better. So look at the wording here, right? Look at the wording here. It's very important to appreciate how Abu Ismail is really articulating this. He's giving us a type of optimism, a type of mentality. And if you remember in the previous session or the one before that, he mentioned, or Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah alayh mentions that a person won't leave something they love except for something that they love more. Okay? Again, someone won't leave something they love, they're attached to, except for the sake of something they love more and they're more attached to. Right? And this is common, this is basic human experience. So it seems like Abu Ismail rahimahullah ta'ala is taking this concept and then trying to boost our own experience with Rajaa and improve Rajaa, hope in our hearts, by utilizing this concept. And that he's saying that, look, leaving sin, especially if the person has become a habitual sin, right? They do it often and they do it consistently. It's very difficult to leave that. Bad habits die hard, as they say. I think that's how it's said. So it becomes difficult to leave that. So what Abu Ismail al-Harawi rahimahullah ta'ala is doing is that he's saying, look, right, there are certain things you're attached to. Okay, let's not deny that, but let's go ahead and really put these things in their place by pointing to something else that you love more, that you love as well, right? So you go to the Muslim who has shortcomings, etc. They may be sinning, and you ask them, "Do you love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?" I mean, they're going to say yes, okay? And you follow it up by saying, "Okay, you love Allah, and you also maybe love this, or you're attached to this particular practice. Why not leave that practice for the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you have?" Right? I think this can begin to reshape the mind to where they view things from a different angle, from a different lens, right? If people can see this, not only is it going to help them shed light to recognize and acknowledge their own love for Allah and for the Quran, etc., for Islam, but they can then use that against certain bad habits that are affecting them. Okay? And the way Abu Ismail is wording it doesn't necessitate sin. It can be something that is permissible and near and dear to you. Okay? I like what I've heard once before, kind of funny, but I guess it kind of falls in line with what's being said here. A certain, Sufi sheikh would refuse to drink green tea. Green tea. He'd refuse to drink it. Why? What's wrong with green tea? Says his heart loves it so much, and he doesn't want that love to compete with his love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Now, I think this is a little bit exaggerating. If someone's love for green tea can challenge their love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that kind of caused me to scratch my head, right? In the end, it's only green tea. Maybe you need to kind of reshape the way you see things. But I guess that's an example, right? So it can be used for permissible, non-problematic behaviors as well. But the idea is that there are certain things in our lives, certain practices that are near and dear to us, right? And we've become accustomed to it. So how do we challenge those things? Or why do we challenge them in the first place? Is because they are taking away from something greater, something better. And we challenge them with that which is also near and dear to us, but we know is better and more perfect for us. So فَرَجَاؤُهُمْ فِي أَنْ يَبْلُغُوا دَرَجَةً مِنَ الْهِمَّةِ تَجْعَلُ وَقْتَهُمْ كُلَّهُ فِي التَّقَرُّبِ إِلَى اللَّهِ. So their hope, right? Now you have that element. Now Abu Ismail, how he's tying this idea into hope is that you have hope that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives you the tawfiq, the enthusiasm, the motivation, the strength, the motivation to make all of your time for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So why do you leave certain practices that are permissible, let's say? Because you do it because now you're seeking something that is even more dearer and nearer to you, right? That's the idea here. So that you spend more time coming closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So how does hope fit into all of this? It's by hoping that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala helps you reach the level of enthusiasm and motivation needed to make all of your time for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So how do we reach this? Okay, so Abu Ismail doesn't give us just an abstract theoretical approach. He points to three elements, as he normally does. or it helps us give us a clear idea of what we're trying to reach here. The way we do this is by number one, rafdul madhudat, right? Refusing our pleasures. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean forbidden pleasures. It could be permissible pleasures, but that cannot be utilized in a way that brings us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or it kind of serves as a rival against our pursuit for Allah, or of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, and remember, now we're tying in some of the elements that we explored in the station of asceticism, and that is rejecting these pleasures doesn't necessitate rejecting engaging these things at a physical level, but rather what our main concern is making sure our heart rejects being attached to these things. So if you remember in asceticism, zuhud and wara, which I've called active and passive asceticism. I think that's a cool translation for them. The idea isn't to refuse engaging the world. It's not about isolating ourselves from participating in the world, but rather it is refusing, making sure our hearts aren't attached to these things. Okay, you have the same idea here. Rafdul madhudat, rejecting and refusing our pleasures, it means our hearts aren't attached to these things. Okay, and I guess if you want to kind of get deeper into like the psychological level, I don't know if psychology really explores the attachment, how the heart becomes attached to these things, or how they explain that. But the idea is that when the heart is attached to something, right, the mind thinks about it more. The body feels in need of it more. Where, you know how we're addicted to coffee and whatnot? If we don't have a cup of coffee, we start getting headaches and stuff like that. So this is like a manifestation of that attachment. I guess in psychology, they'll call it addiction, right? In spirituality, that addiction is sourced in the heart. The heart has now become attached to this thing, and when it doesn't engage this thing, the heart feels a type of void, and then that void manifests itself. It manifests itself in a manner that, or the heart it manifests from the heart in various ways, like a headache, like frustration. You know, when someone's addicted to something and they don't have means to or access to it, they become very aggressive, very frustrated, etc. So that's the idea here. And yes, okay. The second element is لزوم شروط العلم وهو الوقوف عند حدود الأحكام الدينية, is adhering to the conditions of knowledge. And what that means is we not only recognize the boundaries of Allah, where the red lines are, but we stop once we get closer to it. Okay? So part of developing this hope, part of really engaging this type of hope, this level of hope, is by understanding the technicalities of Islamic jurisprudence, understanding what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do, and understanding when you become close, when you're getting closer to these red lines, and how to stop, etc. And then the third element of this level is استقصاء حدود الحمية, والحمية هي العصمة والامتناع من تناول ما يخشى ضرره آجلا أو عاجلا. المراد بالاستقصاء حدود الحمية هو ببذل الجهد. So, and then the third element is simply to do what you need to do to preserve the boundaries of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the previous element is that you understand and recognize where those boundaries are. Okay? And that's the knowledge aspect of it. The third element here is to preserve it, meaning not to transgress these lines. And therefore you do what you need to do. You utilize the stations that we've gone over before and the ideas that we've gone over before in order to prevent ourselves from falling or transgressing these red lines, right? So we put our effort in knowing where these red lines are and knowing what we need to do in order not to fall into them or to transgress them. What are some protocols, some what are the protocols we need to do in order to preserve this? What are the habits that we need to come up with? What are the habits we need to leave in order not to transgress these lines? Okay, so how is this all connected to hope? If you remember, when we spoke about hope, we said that there is hope and there is wishful thinking. Okay, and that wishful thinking is when someone has hope but doesn't follow it up with any sort of actions. Right? For example, someone says, "I hope I get into, for example, medical school," and they don't study at all, and they don't spend any time, preparing for it. That's just wishful thinking. It's not true hope. But hope is when someone says, "I hope to get into med school," and they're doing all that they need to do. They're putting the effort in that's needed to get into med school, for example. So that's the idea here. So that's why he's bringing these three elements. In order for our hope at this level to be true hope, we need to do certain things. In order to get this feeling out of wishful thinking and into the station of hope, we need to learn how to refuse our pleasures, right? Learn how to make sure our heart is disconnected or not attached to these pleasures. We need to learn the technicalities of fiqh, what is allowed, what's not allowed, and then we need to do what's needed to be done in order to not transgress these boundaries. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. And then the final level, الدرجة الثالثة رجاء أرباب القلوب وهو رجاء لقاء الخالق الباعث على الاشتياق المبغض المنغص للعيش المزهد في الخلق. Okay. Again, you have a lot of jargon here. The third level is the level of people who have hearts. Okay, when the Quran says people who have hearts, it means their hearts are truly awoken. They're truly woke. And this again reminds us of one of the very first stations, actually the first station, al-Yaqadha, spiritual awakening. So this is what is meant by those who are spiritually awake. So how does hope help and preserve spiritual awakening? Or spiritual wokeness, if that's even a word. How do they get there, and what preserves it? He says that hope in meeting the Creator, right? This is when hope makes the heart woke, spiritually speaking. Okay, how do we have this goes back even to the station of al-Yaqadha, right? When we said that when is someone spiritually awoke is when they realize their responsibility. And in order to realize their responsibility, they need to contemplate and think about the next life. That is what wakes us up. That we have a end point that we're all going to, and at that point there is there is accountability. That wakes us up. So, in order to kind of preserve that and really strengthen it, the person has hope in their meeting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what does that do for the individual? It does three things. Al-ba'ithu ala al-ishtiyaq. It creates shawq is, what's the word in English? Shawq is when you miss something, right? I'm trying to think of a stronger word. For example, you might have a child who lives in a different state, lives far away from you. That feeling of missing, right, the child, and the feeling of wanting to be reunited with the child, that's shawq, right? And that shawq will not only impact the person's emotions, it will help to keep that person connected to what they are missing, as well as motivate the individual, move them to actually do what needs to be done in order to meet with them. So when your heart is really aching to see your child, you haven't seen them in a while, you'll call them, for example. That's one thing. You will send them a message. You will FaceTime them or talk about them with through whatever, WhatsApp, video, etc. And then you'll start talking about, hey, when can we come visit, or can you come visit? That's shawq really manifesting itself in our behavior. So that's the idea here. When a person is hopeful in meeting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it creates this shawq, this missing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that will then push the person, motivate him or her, impact their behavior in a positive way, where they're going to work towards that meeting. So I hope the analogy kind of drew this point a little bit closer. And the heart, right, here Abu Ismail or Abu Qayyim rahmatullah alayh is defining al-ishtiyaq, this feeling of missing someone, as the heart's travel, the heart traveling to seek something it loves, right? So the fact that you miss something by default means that you are attached to that thing, that you love it, or else you wouldn't miss it. That's just the reality, right? If, for example, you lived in a different country and you had bad experiences there and you're finally out of it, you'll never miss it. You're not gonna say, man, I wish I could go back to it, because there's no attachment there. There's no love for it. But if you had a very positive experience and a very good time in that place, right, you will develop this love for it, and then you'll have this feeling of, man, I want to go back. I want to go visit. Man, maybe this summer I can go and visit, etc. So that's the idea of ishtiyaq. When a person misses Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they have that yearning, they pine for meeting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it develops this action. It impacts their behavior, where the heart is now in a constant state of traveling in order to acquire that which it loves, or to be close to that which it loves. The second element of the third level of hope, a second way being hopeful in meeting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala affects the individual, is that it makes a person, I'm trying to think of a word that's not so negative, not hateful, but it makes them so their hope, they're missing the feeling of missing Allah and wanting to be close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, will also work to effectively deconstruct or shrink the meaning of this life in the person's mind and heart, right? And it will make them really not feel comfortable in this life. Okay, now I'm kind of speaking weird things here, so I got to unpack this. What it's saying is the following. Okay, let's go back to the example of living in a different land. You have land A and land B. Okay, all right. Let me just go ahead and use names. Let's say Canada and South Africa. I'm using two countries that maybe most of us here don't have any connection to, or right, just so it doesn't sound strange. You have Canada and you have South Africa. Someone lived in both, okay? Now, if that person's life in Canada was very stable, very pleasant, comfortable, and they traveled to South Africa and they were uncomfortable, it was difficult, it was stressful, so long as that person is in South Africa, they will always miss what? Canada. Now, let's say the opposite is true. The person's experience in Canada was very negative. A lot of bad things happened. It was stressful. But when they went to South Africa, they felt more comfortable. People there were nicer. They felt like they have a family, etc. So long as they're in South Africa, they'll never wish to go back to what? To Canada, right? So our experiences here affect where we want to be. So the same idea here. The more we love Allah, the more we are hopeful in meeting Him. In order to be with Allah, in order to truly gratify and satisfy that feeling, we have to be in the next life. And so long as our hearts are traveling towards that, wanting to be closer to Allah, wanting to be with Allah, we will see this life as being the barrier between you and that. And therefore this life becomes more and more despised by you, and more discomforting to you. This is what's preventing me from my true happiness. This world right here, I'm trying to draw like, the earth or whatever, right? This world right here is what's barring me from true happiness. the more a person is hopeful in their meeting with Allah, the more they see this life as the antithetical to that. And therefore this life becomes what? Less and less desirable, the heart is less and less attached to it, right? And the heart wants to get away from it more and more. Now, when you look at the dynamics of spirituality and human behavior, and you kind of incorporate sinning into this. Really sinning, when you look at sinning, if you want to just give a very, very general categorization or description of what sin is instant gratification. Sinning, in the end, if you want to look at it from a technical perspective, sinning is instant gratification. When the person sins, they are seeking something, they're doing something that provides them with instant gratification. Whereas religion, when you look at it technically, the gratification is distant. It's in the future, right? Invest now so that your return later is greater. Being attached to this life is enjoy now, but what's the end result? You're not going to get any profit or anything like that. Now, the more a person is sincere in their pursuit of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the more Allah rewards the person. And part of that reward is that because the individual is leaving sin, leaving instant gratification, barring themselves from instant gratification, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewards them by replacing that gratification with an even greater instant gratification. Okay? That's once you kind of get a little bit higher and more engaged, indulged into these experiences. But generally speaking, sinning is really the person seeking instant gratification that the world can provide them, or what they perceive the world can provide them. So whenever a person sins, in reality, if you look at the dynamics of spirituality, it is a sign or a kind of a manifestation of the person's attachment to the world and to worldly things. Okay, I'm talking about technically here, in the dynamics of spirituality. The less a person sins, that it's also a sign that the person is less and less attached to this world. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Yes.
All right. So that's the idea here. So the more a person is hopeful in their meeting with Allah, by default, it will make their minds and their hearts more and more increasingly attached to the next life. And the more attached they are to the next life, the less attached they are to this life, and as a result, the less they're going to sin. The easier it is for them to leave sinning. Okay, so I think it's important to know that. Okay, and then finally, the third level is al-muzhidu عن الخلق. لأن الخلق يحيل بينه وبين محبوبه. The third element of this hope, the more a person is hopeful in their meeting with Allah, the more it will make them ascetic in dealing with the creation itself, with people, with others. And again, this is drawing back to the building on the ideas of the stations of asceticism. And that is, the more connected we are to Allah, the more disconnected our heart becomes to the creation. And again, that doesn't mean isolation. It means I am increasingly less dependent on other people because I'm more dependent on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the opposite is true as well. The less a person is dependent on Allah, or the less dependent a person is on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the more dependent they become on worldly things. Okay? That's just the way the heart works. So the more a person is hopeful in their meeting with Allah, the more attached they become to Allah, and by default, the less attached they are to human beings. And that is true freedom. That is true freedom. Okay? And why? So you have that kind of the natural effect of this. There's also the psychological effect. Why is the person less and less attached to the creation? It's because they perceive the creation to be a type of veil between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're going to distract me from Allah. This isn't to develop a very pessimistic or negative outlook on humans in general. And again, the goal isn't to isolate spiritualists or people seeking Allah from a greater society. But again, when it's reshaping the way we view our place, our functions, and the function of society with us. We start reframing the dynamics here. If I come to visit you, I'm by default, because I am seeking Allah, because I am hopeful in meeting Allah, by default the mind is going to think, well, how can I utilize this in a manner that's going to bring me closer to Allah? Okay, I was invited to a wedding, for example. Man, a wedding is several hours, and crazy things might happen, and it's going to distract me from Allah. I'm gonna have to meet people, say salam, and have small talk, etc. Okay, this is taking me away. This is distracting me from my other worldly pursuits. Well, how about I start thinking about what the Prophet ﷺ said in this regard? How can I utilize the situation to where I can make reward off of it? Right? And you start thinking of the concepts here. Okay, the Prophet ﷺ said this, the Quran says to do this. How can I utilize my time with people to remind them of Allah? You get what I'm saying here? It's not about not attending that wedding. Rather, it's about reframing our approach to that engagement to where we utilize it in a way that brings about a positive result, spiritually speaking. Okay? No. So that's the idea here. Okay? So yeah, that's the concept here. Now, so هذا أفضل أنواع الرجاء وقد قال الله فمن كان يرجو لقاء الله فإن أجل الله لآت ومن كان يرجو لقاء ربه فليعمل عملا صالحا ولا يشرك بعبادة ربه أحدا. This is the best level, the best forms of hope. And Ibn Qayyim then quotes two verses. Whoever is hopeful in their meeting with Allah, then know that your meeting with Allah is close, it's near, right? It's just, time flies, and no one knows when their death is. Death can be close for, many people, and thus their meeting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, temporally speaking, is very close. But even if a person still has 50, 60, 70 years to live, what's 70 years really in the large scheme of things? If human beings have been around for dozens of millennia, we're just a small fragment of that, and it passes by very quickly. So whoever is hopeful in their meeting with Allah, or whoever is hopeful to meet Allah or meeting Allah, then know that Allah's meeting is near. And then the final verse of Surah Al-Kahf, whoever is hopeful to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then they should do righteous deeds and not associate in their worship any partners to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you have hope in Allah. If that hope is improved, enhanced by adding the element of your meeting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then know psychologically, the first verse is kind of addressing our mind. Know it's near. It is near. And then the second one is kind of giving us guidance. Well, it's near. What should you do? Then you should do good deeds and be sincere in your worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that concludes the station of al-Raja. And the next station is the station of al-Raghbah. Let me just open it. Okay. Raghbah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَيَدْعُونَنَا رَغَبًا وَرَهَبًا. Raghbah is also a type of hope. Okay, and the difference between hope, this Raghbah, and Raja, is that Raja is a type of tama', meaning when you hope for something using Raja, it means you have a type of what's tama' in English? You have a type of so when you want something that you cannot necessarily attain by yourself, and therefore you need someone stronger than you, more capable than you to do it for you. That is a type of tama. And you can also add to that, tama is when you want something more than what you deserve. Okay? So Raja is referring to this type of hope. I am hopeful in achieving something that really I don't deserve. So when we are hopeful that Allah provides us with paradise, right? None of us will ever deserve it, except if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestows His, mercy and compassion, grace upon us. Also, if we are hopeful in our meeting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's not really in our hands. We cannot cause this to happen, right? We're not allowed to bring death upon ourselves. And even if a person, dies by suicide, that's not a good way to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we have no control over the things that we have raja for. Not necessarily. We can act upon it, and we can do what Allah tells us to do in order to obtain it, but in the end, it is Allah who gives it. Okay? So, for example, whoever wants guidance from Allah, it is sourced in Allah. He is the one who provides us with guidance. And He also provides us with the methods and what we need to do in order to obtain that guidance. But in the end, it is Allah who's giving us that guidance. It's not like, okay, if we do steps 1, 2, and 3, you'll find a treasure of guidance in front of you. You can go ahead and take it, right? Rather, we do these things, and then we have hope that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to accept it and then give it to us, all right? Raghbah, on the other hand, is an actual pursuit. It is the what I am doing in order to obtain it. It's the talab. And Raghbah is the fruits of Raja. So Raja is kind of the trunk, it is the roots. And when you have true and correct Raja, it manifests itself in Raghbah. Okay? And this Raghbah is really the actions. So we spoke about this, and we kind of alluded to it, that true hope is hope that is followed up with actions, right? Whereas hope without actions is wishful thinking. So Raghbah is referring to that second part of hope, the second step of hope. You have the first step, which is really the internal. I have hope in Allah, right? That He's going to help me do this, that I hope that Allah gives me this, I hope that I can get this from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Raghbah is when you start applying what needs to be done in order for that hope to be a spiritual experience. Okay, does that make sense? There's a lot of overlap here, and then, you'll have discussions as to what each means and how they're different. Some will say there's really no difference, and these are equally synonymous, while others will try and differentiate. And to give an analogy, to hopefully draw this point a little bit closer to our minds, is that Raghbah to Raja is like harab to khawf. Okay, let me translate that. Raghbah, this action-based hope, in comparison to Raja, which is emotional hope, is similar to running. Is similar to the relation between running and fear. Okay, why do we run? Because something scared us. We are afraid of something, and that fear caused us to run. Okay, the relationship of Raghbah to Raja is that we act because we hoped in something, and when we hope in something, we act upon it. Does that make it a little bit clearer? Good? Okay. So, I want to make sure everyone understands it. You understand it, ladies? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Great. So, al-Raghbah, according to Abu Ismail rahimahullah ta'ala, he says that هي من الرجاء بالحقيقة لأن الرجاء طمع يحتاج إلى تحقيق والرغبة سلوك على التحقيق. Abu Ismail says that Raghbah is a branch of Raja. It's a branch of this hope. And that because hope is a type of yearning that requires pursuit. Okay, the person, when we have hope for something, we need to pursue it. That's what he's saying here. We need to pursue it in order to make that hope true, in order to make it come true. وَالرَّغْبَةُ سُلُوكٌ عَلَى التَّحْقِيقِ. And raghbah is really the path towards making it come true. So الرجاء طمع يحتاج إلى تحقيق أي طمع في مغيب مشكوك. حصوله. So the word طمع here, Ibn Qayyim is further defining it. He's saying طمع is, you have طمع for something, you have this type of yearning for something that is unknown and you're not sure if you can attain it. Okay? So the unknown isn't that you hope for something that you don't know anything about. That's not what's meant by this. It's that really you are hopeful for something that you don't know if you will be able to really obtain it. That's the idea here. Like, for example, a person's hope in entering paradise. Okay? The fact that you are hoping for it infers that there is a part of you that thinks or that recognizes that you might not be able to obtain that. Okay? So if you are guaranteed something, if you know 100% you're guaranteed this, you don't really have hope for it. Or your heart doesn't begin to utilize this concept or this emotion of hope in regards to that thing. So for example, alhamdulillah, and we all have food in our refrigerators. Okay? We're not waking up in the morning saying, oh Allah, please provide me with food. Because we think it's guaranteed for us, right? We feel that type of feeling. But if someone is waking up and they don't have refrigerators and they don't have access to food, or there's a drought or there's some major problems, when they wake up they become hopeful for food, right? So the fact, when we have hope for something, it infers and it is part of the acknowledgement that you might not be able to obtain that thing. So you need hope to kind of boost your morale in order to keep you connected to that thing that you would like paradise. The reason why we hope for paradise is because we recognize we're not guaranteed paradise. And the more a person recognizes that lack of guarantee, the more hopeful they become in that regard. And someone who says, oh, I'm guaranteed paradise, I feel sorry for them. So الرغبة السلوك, what he means by this is that يقصد أنها لا تكون إلا بعد تحقق. يرغب في let me see what he's saying here. يقصد أنها لا تكون إلا بعد تحقق. Okay, so Abu Ismail in this is that in this part of the definition, he's saying that he's alluding to his opinion that Raghbah is stronger than hope. Raghbah is stronger than Rajaa. And the reason is because the person, in order to achieve that which they are hopeful for, must act upon it. And therefore, the person's heart becomes, their iman really becomes attached to the process of reaching that which they hope for. Okay? Ibn Qayyim says this might not be true. He questions the authenticity of this. Because really in reality, Raghbah, when you pursue something, when you act upon your hope, there is also an element of unknown in regards to that. So although a person is hopeful in getting to med school, and that is something that is not guaranteed to them or for them, as they study and do what they need to do in order to get to med school, right, their success in doing that is also not guaranteed. So you have overlap there. So Ibn Qayyim says, where am I? It would be incorrect to say that one is stronger than the other. Yeah, so it would be inaccurate to say that one is stronger than the other. They are two branches of the same, they are dependent on one another. You cannot have Raghbah without Rajaa, and you cannot have Rajaa without Raghbah. So they're not independent of each other, and therefore one cannot be stronger than the other. They need to work in that type of synchrony. And then okay. So I think that should clarify exactly the difference between the two. We good on that? Okay, so let's go ahead and stop here before we enter the three levels of al-Raghbah, inshallah. Sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in.